Well, I just wanted to start off by saying how thrilled I am to be doing this talk. It's a subject that I've become really quite passionate about. And when Mel asked me to do it, I jumped at it because I am a member of the Aspetuck Land Trust. And I became a member this year after I became more aware of the amazing work that Mel and the whole group is doing, and the Green Corridor effort is just amazing. And it so much aligns with so many of the things that I'm interested in, pollinator pathway, the watershed, and of course the voices of nature. So thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm so thrilled to help support the great work that you guys are doing at the Aspetuck Land Trust. So today I'm going to talk about sounds, particularly the sounds of nature, but the whole idea of the soundscape and what that is, and then introduce you to this emerging science of soundscape ecology, what that is and why it matters, and actually why what we listen to matters, because it does have a profound effect on our understanding of the natural world and our own sense of our place in it and our sense of well-being. And then I'll spend a few minutes talking a little bit about some of the practical things that you can do to welcome those voices of nature into your garden or wherever you are. It could be your balcony, your patio. It's amazing what you can do with a little plot of land to bring pollinators and nature and the voices of nature back into your world. So I was just, I developed this talk several months ago. I started reading about soundscape ecology a couple of years ago, but I've been interested in the sounds of nature for quite a while. But I just added this slide in because I'm reading this great book by Terry Tempest Williams. And if you don't know about her, I really highly recommend her book. She's a wonderful writer about nature and people and the interaction between the two. And particularly interested in the Southwest, but what she writes about is just of profound significance more broadly. I was really taken with this particular quote. She talks about a chevron of geese, and this is what she says: the chevron of geese will fly past our window, Canada geese. I hear them first and see them second. Sound shapes our perceptions in inexplicable ways. Our windows are always open and wildness enters our home. And I'm just going to quickly play, whoops, went back by mistake. Hang on. I'm going to quickly just play a few sounds of Canada geese, as if you may not need them and you may not particularly like them. But for me, they're a real sound of nature, and perhaps that's partly because I'm from Canada originally. But I think the reason that this quote really struck me was the idea of how sound does shape your perceptions. And sometimes it's sort of subliminal or subconscious. But when you think about how profoundly important sound has been to us as we've evolved as people, and to being tuned into the sounds of nature for our own safety and well-being, the idea that we sort of disconnected from it, it does some harm to our sense of belonging to the natural world and our sense of comfort within it. So I just like the idea too of our windows opening, and when windows are open, wildness enters. Of course, we do live in the Northeast, so our windows may not always be open, particularly in winter, but perhaps we could also think a little bit about the idea of opening not only our ears, but our hearts to the sounds of nature, and letting them enter through our ears and into our souls and our hearts, and how that can help us really reconnect again with the natural world. So you may be wondering why I'm speaking about it. I'm not a soundscape ecologist. I'm not an ecologist. I would say I'm an amateur naturalist, and I've been for quite a long time. And it's amazing that I actually have this photograph, because this, I would actually say, documents a really important turning point in my life when I was like 5 or 6 years old. My family and I were staying at a cabin in a fairly remote part of New Brunswick in Canada, which is where my parents were from. and I was just recovering from encephalitis. Fortunately, my dad was a doctor, so he could sort of look after me. But when I sort of started to feel better, a young girl in a cabin nearby brought this bullfrog to me to sort of welcome me back to the land of the living. And this frog, I became just fascinated by it and everything about it, actually. But the sounds that it made to me were just so intriguing. And so I feel like I can actually trace my interest in nature and the sounds of nature to this moment. And I just want to play you what a bullfrog sounds like. This little audio is going to start with some green frogs, and then you'll hear that sort of deep bellowing of the bullfrog. And we have them, of course, in our neck of the woods. That's the green frog, and then the bullfrog starts to kick in. So keep your ears open. You're not going to be hearing these fellows much right now, but when spring starts to come in summer, you'll definitely be hearing them surrounding you if you're open your ears to it. So you can't really talk about sounds and nature without, of course, talking about Rachel Carson. And I'm sure most of you know of her or have read her work. She, of course, was the famous science writer and marine biologist who in 1962 wrote a book called The Silent Spring. And she wrote about it after sort of noticing the sounds of nature had become muted. And she had noted that, you know, particularly in spring and at dawn, if you ever are awake as dawn is just starting to come, particularly in spring, the sounds of the birds in the natural world are just so redolent and loud. And she started to notice that those sounds were not happening anymore, or they were happening in a very diminished state. It ultimately led her to look into it and discover the problem was significantly, was pollution, but particularly DDT. And through her work, ultimately, DDT was banned, and that has brought about this sort of resurgence in many kind of songbirds and bald eagles and birds at the higher end of the sort of predatory cycle. So she was a really profoundly important person. This whole idea of helping people understand how the sounds of nature are an indicator of the health of nature. And more recently, this field of soundscape ecology has evolved. And one of the guys that's really focusing on it is a guy named Brian Pijanowski, who's at, I think, Purdue University. His sort of mentor was a guy named Bernie Krause. I'll be talking about both of them more. They're really kind of some of the main people really focusing on this field of soundscape ecology and how it is this important auditory link with the natural world. And without it, we do sort of start to experience that there's something that scientists and doctors have started to describe as a nature deficit disorder. And part of that is not only not being in nature, but not actually sensing it and hearing it. So when I started putting this talk together, it was actually before COVID. And as COVID started to rear its ugly head, I started noticing headlines and stories appearing everywhere that talked about nature and how COVID was causing people to take a breath, take a moment, and to really appreciate nature. So back to the soundscape. Our particular soundscape has been interesting. But when you think about the sounds of nature, so not only have people been sort of reconnect with nature during this time of COVID, but a lot of those headlines and stories have actually focused on sounds. And it turns out that with much reduced human activity during COVID in the form of traffic, shipping, certainly airline traffic, all kinds of sounds have been very muted, and people even in cities have started to hear the sounds of nature in a way that they hadn't for years or maybe never. And so that a lot of the stories have either focused on how the reduction in human sound has made the sounds of nature seem louder and has caused people to connect with them more deeply, but also the way in which natural sounds are actually soothing and stress reducing for us. I mean, there was a great story in Outside Magazine recently, and it was talking, I think it's the third headline there. There's a guy named Chris Watson who's a sound recorder and has done most of the sound for David Attenborough for years. And he was talking about how sounds have perhaps gotten louder, but we're also just becoming more mindful and we're becoming better listeners. And he also commented on the fact that in his yard, he lives in England, where blackbirds sort of fill a niche similar to robins here. He started noticing that their songs were becoming more vigorous and longer and deeper. And he thought sounded like they were getting more creative. And he surmises that the individual blackbirds could hear other blackbirds more fully now that the other sounds were not sort of causing them to be blocked out, and that they had to sort of up their game a little bit sonically to be more attractive to mates, to potentials. So COVID, it has turned out that the soundscape and the sounds of nature and COVID have sort of come together in an unexpected way. But, you know, speaking about human sounds, we definitely create quite a bit of noise. And there was a great article in the Atlantic about a year ago. The title was "Why Everything is Getting Louder." And in that, the author notes that the earliest noise complaint in history was actually in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is an ancient Mesopotamian myth about this heroic figure Gilgamesh. And in that, the gods become really disgruntled and angry and really lose all patience with humankind, and they decide to send a flood. This whole idea of the flood myth that is part of many cultures and religions. In any case, the reason that they sent that flood and they were so troubled by humans was because of the noise that humans were making. And one can imagine if the noise was that bad then, what that noise would sound like today to the gods. Because of course, the sounds of nature are getting louder all the time. The National Park Service has a natural sounds division, and they do survey every several years. I think the last one was done probably in the early 80s or something like that. But there they found that noise pollution doubles or triples every 30 years. And they also found that close to 150 million, maybe more people in America are actually living in conditions where they're frequently exposed to sounds that are far above the recommended limits of noise that are safe for humans. And not surprisingly, noise pollution is much more of a problem in areas, in less affluent areas, as is many other forms of pollution. So we're loud, we're getting louder. And I thought this map was really interesting. Again, National Park Service. What this shows is a typical day in the US, and it's how loud different parts of the country are. Now, this map includes both human and natural sound. So it's interesting to see how much louder the East is than the West. I guess that's not surprising when you think about how so much of the West is either mountainous or desert. And you can see, I'm just going to put my little laser pointer on. You can see here, you know, a lot of this is desert and of course, that is the quietest part of the country. The loudest parts are places that have human noise, but are also the environment, the natural sounds are actually louder in places that have more humidity, that have more denser plant life, not surprisingly. So you'll see that over here, both human noise and denser plant life, more humidity than, of course, in the arid past. So just to take a quick minute to think about the difference between sound and noise. Sometimes we use them as synonyms, but really noise is a kind of sound. And it really is I think often we think of sound or noise as loud, that it's loud, and it can be, certainly, but noise tends to have other features as well. Usually, it's going to be something that's unwanted or is not appropriate for a particular context. It may be repetitive. A lot of the problem for most of us when we experience a loud sounds and it becomes noisome is that it's uncontrollable and it's jangling to us. And it's very often, one man's noise might be another man's music. I can think of the kind of music that I like to listen to growing up versus what my brothers listened to, which was more on the heavy metal side of things. So noise versus sound. Noise is a particular kind of sound that's just kind of unpleasant. And while we're on this sort of tack of distinguishing between words, I'll think just for a moment about the difference between hearing and listening. So hearing is one thing, it's more of a passive thing. Listening, of course, is something that involves us or requires us to be more fully engaged in the experience of hearing, to actually listen to what's going on sonically in our environments. So it's interesting on looking into this to see how noise actually affects wildlife. Of course, many forms of wildlife, birds, maybe that comes to mind first, their singing is not just a pleasurable activity, though I have a pretty good sense that it's something that they do enjoy. It's a survival strategy. It's a part of a mating strategy. And when they're in a position where their sounds can't be heard, it really interferes with their ability to find mates, to find food, and to survive. It turns out that birds in noisy environments, particularly industrial ones, tend to have fewer offspring than those in quieter environments. Scientists have found also that bird life, bird activity, bird nesting in areas that are close to loud highways is far diminished to the activity of birds further in, away from the road. They're getting away from the noise so that they can be heard. Another study found that in elk and wolf, stress hormone levels that were detected in their droppings really rose when snowmobiles came on the scene and then diminished when they left. A similar pattern as the result of ship traffic in the North Atlantic and whales. And so all of this can lead to decreased species diversity in particular areas, really impacts bird populations and other populations. And there's even research that suggests that can actually affect, and that was based on examining tree rings. So we know that noise and sound affects birds, and it certainly also affects us. There's a whole list of ways that noise can affect us. And when I was creating this talk, I was sitting at my desk. It was a beautiful spring morning. It was quiet. I could hear chipmunks and birds. And then suddenly the landscaping crew for our new neighbors arrived nearby. And it felt like a sort of full frontal sonic assault. It was just so loud. And I felt all of these things. Stress levels rose, check. Faster heart rate, check. Didn't affect my sleep, but I was having more trouble paying attention. I felt really annoyed and anxious. So noise can affect us in all of these ways. And interestingly, there was a study done about the effect of sound and noise on children in New York City. And there was a school that they'd studied, the researchers studied, and it found that the classrooms that were on the side of the school that was right up against a train track, the sound of the train came along every 4.5 minutes or so, and it was a really high sound level, almost on level with what might be the sound of a rock concert. And that would happen every 4.5 minutes or so and last for several minutes. And then it would take a while for the kids and the teacher to be able to sort of get back to where they were. And they found that over time, those students on that side of the school versus those who were on the quiet side, they lagged about 11 months behind in their learning. And they attributed that to the eruption of noise into their lives and then to their ability to learn. So the good news, of course, for us humans, for us humans, is that the sounds of nature have a really calm-inducing, stress-reducing effect on us if we open our ears to them. They're obviously pleasurable. They make us feel better. If we start to listen for them, they can really help to hone our senses. And I think that it really helps promote this idea of biophilia, which is a concept that has been really promoted and written about a lot by E.O. Wilson, who is a great Harvard biologist, a myrmecologist. That's his specialty. He specializes in ants, but he's also very interested in just biodiversity in general. And he believes strongly that biophilia, which is the innate human tendency to want to connect with nature, is a really important part of developing our respect for nature. And if we lose that sense, that's one of the reasons that we fall into this terrible disequilibrium with nature. So interestingly too, the sounds of nature are, they're a proxy really for the health of the environment and biodiversity in general. The greater the density and diversity of nature's chorus, the healthier the environment is around you. So not only do the sounds of nature contribute to our own sense of health and well-being, but they actually are an indicator of the health and well-being of the world around us. So just pause for a second here to get you to think for a moment perhaps about if you were to open your window now, or maybe in spring, or maybe in fall, what are the sounds that you would hear from your window? And just asking you to think just for a moment about what those sounds might be and what they mean to you. And right now, what I'm hearing when I open the window, I don't even need to, right, fellow. This is a Carolina Wren, and I'm going to let him play for a moment. They're around here all year, but right around this time of year, they're particularly loud and present, and it's just a really beautiful sound, and you can hear them throughout the winter as well. So let me just play this and let you watch him sing for a moment. There's a cardinal chipping in there too. So let me just come back to the presentation. Bear with me for one moment. So interestingly, when Mel put together her flyer for this presentation, she happened to include a Carolina Wren on it. She must have been hearing one outside her window as well. So I want to talk for a moment just about soundscape, and obviously it's a similar word to the word landscape, and the soundscape is basically is made up of the sounds that you can hear in a particular moment around you. But divided by soundscape ecologists into three kind of main groups of sound. One is geophony, which are the non-biological sounds, natural sounds out there. So that would be the wind, rain, it might be the sounds of rocks falling or a burbling brook. So geophony is one kind of sound that you might hear outside your window. Then there is biophony, which is the music of non-human organisms. So it's birds and insects and amphibians. Those are probably the three areas we'll focus on most today. And then anthrophony, which is the sound that is created by humans. And I do want to say that anthrophony really could be divided into two kinds of sound, because obviously humans create some of the most beautiful sounds in the world as well as some of the worst. You know, anyone who's a music lover can appreciate that, but anyone can think of the sound of someone they love laughing or just their voice. So humans, anthrophony isn't just unpleasant sounds, it's also really pleasant ones. But I think for our purposes today, we're going to focus a little more on the less pleasant sounds, the noise that we make, and how we can actually kind of try to fight against them and allow the biophonic sounds to be louder and more obvious and present in our world. Just a quick slide to reinforce that point. You know, the sound, the geophony, or the wind, the waves, anthrophony, human voices, and really the airplane that's created by us, and then birds are biophony at play. That's obviously not a local environment, but it gives you just a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about a soundscape. So back to the local environment. As I said, we'll talk, we're going to focus mostly on three categories of creatures in our world and how we can help attract them to our yards. And the first one is birds, an obvious one. And these are just 5 of our local denizens who you might see in your yard. The barred owl in the middle there, we had a family that took up residence in a woodlot next to us, and that was one just sitting one morning outside of my window on the lawnmower handle, just staring in at me. But let me just play briefly the sound here of a bluebird that's got just kind of a really sweet sound, and if you're lucky enough to have them in your yard, you'll appreciate this. And then let me just quickly play the sound of the barred owl. The barred owl actually has quite a few different sounds. Some of them are quite chilling. Those are pretty, if you walk out and just hear those and you've never heard them before, you can imagine that they might take you aback a bit, but really interesting. And then the last one is one that you'll probably be familiar with, the red-bellied woodpecker. And that's the fellow on the lower left. So just a few of the birds. There are obviously very many around here. I'm sure many of you are members of the Audubon Society or birders. You're going to be very familiar with many of these sounds. So the next group of sounds, we talked about birds, are the sounds of insects that buzz. And I'm particularly focusing on native insects, and we're talking here about our native bees. There are many kinds of them, native wasps and beetles, and these are all the important, not all, but make up a huge part of the important group of pollinators that we need to keep alive in this world. Without pollinators, I can't remember the estimate, but the idea is that humans would not survive very long at all if we lost all of our pollinators. So we certainly want to encourage them and their sounds. This is just this sound of, I don't know if anybody has ever heard a bee in a squash blossom, for example. It can be quite a loud and really quite lovely sound. That's what you're hearing now. And then, so we had birds, we had insects that buzz, and then insects that chirp and trill. And there's a there's a scientific word for that, that's stridulate, which it means that these are insects that create sound either by rubbing their wings or their legs together. And we have a vast array of these in our yards, all kinds of crickets and grasshoppers, cicadas, and katydids. The katydids have stopped now, but they can, you know, they'll start sort of mid-late summer and go deep. I've had them go well into November, and I'm just going to quickly play this of a katydid for you. And I'm sure you'll recognize that. They can be quite almost deafening at nights in late summer and early fall. So, and then the last category that we'll focus on today are amphibians, specifically frogs and toads, because they're the ones that really make the sounds. I've included the logo for Frog Watch USA just to remind me to mention it. It's an amazing group that is engaging people sort of for citizen science to learn the sounds of frogs and toads, and so they can help contribute to keeping tabs on the health of our frog and toad populations, which have been imperiled by various kinds of pollution. So frogs, toads, they're wonderful sounds in the spring. For me, the sound of the spring peepers is one of the early sort of heralds of the coming spring. I look forward to that every year. And then in summer and into the fall, this lovely sound of the gray tree frog, I'm going to play for you briefly. You've probably heard this. I didn't know what it was when I first moved to the country, and I thought it was an owl or something, but these are little tiny gray tree frogs which can turn green when they're on green plants, and they can make a very loud noise, again, part of their mating strategy. All of these amphibians, same thing. So the natural sound, soundscape ecologists equate it to the idea of the canary in the coal mine, that they're going to give us a heads up, or they do give us a heads up when there are problems in the natural world. There are changes, certainly the climate change is affecting the sounds of nature, weather patterns do, and certainly pollution of all kinds affects the sounds that we're hearing. So they're really important indicators of biodiversity and the health of the environments. So as you've inferred already, and we've kind of addressed, but just to be clear about what soundscape ecology is, it's listening for, it's the study of the sounds in the landscape, but not just individually, it's the interrelationship of those sounds and how they relate to each other. So human sounds, the anthrophony, how they affect the biophonic sounds, and then how geophonic sounds all connect and affect the lives of each of the beings within that soundscape. And I like to say that, to quote the Bernie Krause again, who's the father of soundscape ecology, talks about it as the study of the narrative of place. He talks about how there are so many narratives and stories to be heard and to be understood out there in the natural world that we won't be able to actually benefit from if we aren't hearing what they're saying. Another lovely quote, that the air thrums with stories that are generated from the creatures in the natural world. And of course, soundscape ecology looks also at the way climate, land transformations, human activity, all of these things affect the sounds, and then how the sounds all affect each other, and how this works as an indicator for environmental health. And I think that if we all become sort of amateur soundscape ecologists, we will really, it will inevitably become better stewards of the natural world. What you pay attention to, you learn to care about, and listening to the sounds of nature is a great way to encourage that biophilia, that protection, that caring about the natural world. So there are ways to welcome nature's chorus to your yard. And for the last few minutes of talk, I'm going to mention a few of those. There's the idea of planting wisely. If you build it, certainly they will come, I can assure you. Adding additional inducements, water is perhaps the greatest, and we'll talk about that. Avoiding things that deter, kill, or harm, reducing our own sound prints, and then actually sort of cultivating your listening skills by practicing mindful listening, and a couple of ways to do that. So first thing that you can do to really encourage the birds, the insects, the amphibians to come into your yard is to plant wisely. And if you're a gardener, if you are interested in pollinators, you're of course, since you're on this call, you're interested in the green corridor, excuse me, the pollinator pathway, a lot of this will be second nature to you. So certainly planting native plants attracts more of the natural world, more creatures of the natural world, more flora and fauna. As native plants have evolved, they've evolved in concert with our native creatures. So our native creatures have learned to eat native plants and to lay their eggs and rear their young on them. So having native plants is a really important aspect of sort of creating an environment that's more friendly to the natural world. Diversifying what you plant is also important, because obviously different birds are attracted to different kinds of seeds and berries, as are insects and other living organisms. When you're thinking about diversifying, it's not just different plants, but also thinking about what seeds, what fruits, what flowers are blooming or are appearing when, and sort of providing more different kinds of plants that will provide food and hosting sources for animals over the whole course of the year. Then think about layering your environment. In nature, you know, it's not one level. There are plants, there are shrubs at a higher level, and trees, and different insects and birds, of course, dwell in different parts of that landscape. If you're a birder, for instance, you'll know that the ovenbird is one that you'll see sort of skulking around the leaf meal at the bottom of a forest, and a scarlet tanager you're much more likely to see high up in a tree. So think about layering your plantings. And then as you saw in that Aspatech Land Trust video, reducing your amount of lawn is really important. In the lawn, there is no biodiversity. Doug Tellamy speaks of this all the time. We want to reduce the amount of lawn so that we will have more food sources and more shelter for all of the insects and birds and amphibians. So reducing the amount of lawn is a really important step that you can take. And also planting more densely in certain areas, perhaps not everywhere, but the more densely you plant, or you're leaving some corners of your yard more densely planted, you'll have more shelter these creatures, and there'll be more nesting and roosting places and places to seek protection from predators. So in case you need to be persuaded, and I suspect I'm preaching to the choir, planting native plants, you do not have to sacrifice beauty. They are some of the most gorgeous plants in the world. Just for example, the upper left, just there, you have the purple New England aster and the cardinal flower. The upper right, Mayapples. On the lower right, the beautiful blooms of common milkweed. And then in the middle at the lower part, goldenrod and those blue vervain in there, and some other beautiful flowers. So plant native, and at least partly, and you will benefit from the beauty as well as attracting insects and other animals. So I talked about adding additional inducements, and I said that water is one of the key ones, and it's so true. It's not just it's not just frogs and toads, but birds and insects of all kinds. Once you have water, you will find that you will attract a lot more creatures to your yard. You can have shallow containers on your patio, bird baths. If you're lucky to have a pond, that's great. You could install a pond. You might have vernal pools or wetlands. All of those are great sources of water. Of course, if you do have standing water, you're going to want to replace it regularly because, of course, we don't want to attract mosquitoes to our yards. But if you do clean out a bird bath or a plate regularly, or if you have a little bit of running water in the form of a recycling fountain in your pond or your container, that's a great way to keep the mosquitoes at bay. Shelter is another important thing. We talked about planting densely to provide shelter and nesting places for birds and other animals. There's other ways to do that, and I'm going to show you pictures in a moment that will sort of highlight what I'm talking about. But in addition to setting up toad abodes and bee hotels, you can also leave, if you can, in some small area or larger area of your yard, some snags and wood piles, because many creatures can find a home in those. Obviously, bird feeders. And I found that just putting, because I'm a gardener of lots of places like bamboo pools and other things for birds, and actually dragonflies and butterflies to perch on, are great ways. These are all great ways to attract the natural world to your yard. These are just a few pictures from my own yard. I got lots of frogs. Started out on the lower left with this tub with, actually it's also in the middle, that has a little bamboo fountain. One year I found I had 13 green frogs just in that little tub. But water, I have found, has been an amazing way to attract birds as well as amphibians, and just a few ways to provide water. And I ended up being so enamored with providing the water for these creatures that I put in a little pond. And it has a little bit of a fountain at the back, not enough to deter frogs, but it has certainly attracted a lot of wildlife. The most recent one was a little mink that I saw swimming in that pond. So just to reinforce the importance of water and sound, this is a little different from the map I showed you earlier. This one is a summer day, imagining that sound, that humans are not producing any sound, which of course is an alternative universe. But this map shows, it's quite interesting. It's going to highlight here again. Here is, again, the quietest part of the country is the driest part, either desert or mountain. And also, interestingly, you can see here that Florida, the Mississippi Valley, even the Hudson Valley there, these areas that are more densely treed and more densely planted and have more moisture, are also creating more sound. So water and sound do tend to go together. And I see that we're at the top of the hour, so I'm just going to take a couple more minutes to wrap up and provide you with a few more ideas about soundscape ecology and how you can enjoy the sounds of nature. Another thing that you can do is to put up a bee hotel. I have one in my yard. This is not in my yard. This is kind of the deluxe version. You could create one that is just part of this. And these are particularly attractive for some of our native bees, like mason bees and leafcutter bees, that are more solitary or somewhat communal, but they don't live in the hive situation that honeybees do, which are not native. So if you put these up, I guarantee that you will get some more of our native bees frequenting your yard. I mentioned toad abodes. They're also good for frogs. You can upturn a pot and take a little hole out of it, or just put it on its side. I found that these little sort of pieces of bark rolled up are great. All kinds of ways. The idea is just to create a a humid or a damp spot that toads and frogs can find refuge in, particularly in hot days. That's just another example in my yard. You can see a green frog there about to enter that sort of bark toad abode by the pond. I mentioned supplying perches. This is just my yard at the beginning in the summer, or at the beginning of the spring, actually. And unfortunately, there was no picture with birds and dragonflies on it, but I would look out and almost always see one on either on the bamboo stakes or on the hummingbird feeders, shepherd's hooks, or wherever. So if you want to see your visitors, I really highly suggest putting up something that's in the form of a perch. And of course, we want to avoid things that are going to deter, harm, or kill. Really either reduce or completely eliminate pesticides and herbicides. If you encourage these frogs and toads and birds and beneficial insects to your yard, you're going to find that they're going to do a great job in taking care of a lot of the pests that are in your yard. It's estimated that a single frog can eat up to 100 insects in a night, and then about 10,000 insects in a whole season. So that's just one frog. Keep an eye on your pets, dogs and cats in particular. Cats, research has suggested, can kill up between somewhere 1.3 and 4 million birds a year. I keep her inside. I love cats, but we really need to keep our eye on our pets. Minimize disturbance in your yard, in your backyard pond, I should say, or wetlands, and just let them be, essentially. And then if you do have a pond, don't add non-native frogs or toads or fish. They can spread disease, and they can also prey on some of our native frogs, particularly their eggs and tadpoles. So think about just leaving it natural, and cut the lights. Turns out that insects aren't so much attracted to lights. It actually sort of stuns them. They're sort of lost in the lights. And one recent study suggested that about a third of the insects that might be swirling around your light at night are not there in the morning, either because of exhaustion or they've been picked off by predators. So maybe reconsider your lights or how long you have your lights on. And then reduce your sound print. Lots of ways to do that. If you reduce your amount of lawn, of course, you're going to be mowing a lot less. So less effort and less noise and a lot more biodiversity. You might consider non-gas powered machines. Again, I'm throwing all of these out, not suggesting that everybody can or will adopt all of these. I still have a gas powered lawnmower. But lawnmowers, non-gas powered electric machines produce far less sound. So just something else to consider. And along those lines, the leaf blower, not only is it loud, but leaves are really important places for our beneficial insects to find refuge, to overwinter. They're also great fertilizer for our gardens and lawns. So just maybe rethink what you're doing with your leaves and realize that they're this great sort of natural fertilizer that falls from the trees every year, as Doug Tallamy would say. And if you do have a sound system, maybe reconsider it and enjoy the sounds of nature instead. So I think the idea is that if we tune into the soundscapes and to the sounds of nature, we'll appreciate them more deeply, and we'll be much more likely to preserve what we care about and act accordingly. So a couple of just quick ideas before we wrap up about ways to sort of hone your listening skills. You know, the whole idea of mindfulness, which is quite popular now, is a great way to focus on the sounds in nature is to just apply those ideas and to really just focus on a particular sound or a set of sounds one idea is to think about having what you might call a sound diet, and perhaps play a game maybe with your kids, and identify, say, 5 pleasurable sounds in a 20-minute period, and then take the next 20 minutes and see what you're hearing that you don't like so much. And maybe then consider what you'd like more of in your life and in your world, and then what you might like less of, and is there anything that you can do about it? I found out about this quite recently. There's a great magazine called Emergence Magazine, and they had this great piece on 5 practices for listening to the language of birds. If you get a chance to look that up, I highly recommend it. The author makes a point that the birds, just listening to the birds, opened this fresh dimension of sensory experience, and made the author realize, tune into the ecological rhythms and connect more fully with the sounds and feel more at home in nature and in their own home. You could also consider taking a sound walk. He's a Canadian musician, Murray Schafer, but also sort of pioneered the field of acoustic ecology. He suggests going out for a walk and listening really actively to the sounds that you're hearing. And maybe you could focus on adding up the number of times you hear a specific kind of sound. If you're with kids, maybe do a little scavenger hunt for kinds of sounds, buzzes or squeaks. There's all kinds of ways to encourage your listening skills. And making people more aware of their soundscapes, it's suggested will actually be a better way to curb noise pollution than actually any kind of noise ordinance that could be introduced. So I'd like to sort of conclude, or nearly conclude, with this quote from W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poet. The world is full of magic things patiently waiting for our senses to grow sharper. So let's all sharpen our listening skills. And I just wanted to briefly play this beautiful sound. If you're a birder, you may know it. If not, listen for it. It's the lovely trilling of a wood thrush, which if you're lucky, you'll hear in the spring and summer. And then, as I mentioned, Bernie Krause, the father of Soundscape Ecology, he's written a wonderful book called The Great Animal Orchestra. And I also highly recommend his, it's about a 10-minute TED Talk about soundscape ecology and the sounds of nature and the importance of them to humans. The idea that we evolved listening and hearing nature, and as we cut ourselves off from those sounds, we sort of cut ourselves off from our natural home. So if you get a chance, look him up, and by all means, listen to his TED Talk. So just to quickly recap, just start by practicing your listening skills. Think about planting native, minimize your lawns. Again, it's like a green desert. Introduce more biodiversity into your yards. Hold off on the chemicals, add shelter, add water, perhaps reduce your sound print, and take a deep breath, pause. This COVID crisis has really caused all of us to pause a little bit, and perhaps we've all started to notice the sounds of nature more deeply as a result. And so I just want to leave you with a few sources, and I have a little flyer that I've put together that I'll share with Mary Ellen, and she can share with all of you at the end if you're interested. These are just some of the sources of information on the topic. This is particularly where you will find information, pollinator-pathway.org. The Audubon offers lots of lists for lots of plants on lists for birders, lots of other sources. Of course, Doug Tallamy's books are a huge, rich source of information. The North River Watershed Association too. These are just a few of the books that I found particularly useful. Bernie Krause's books and then Doug Tallamy's books are wonderful. And if you haven't read it, consider taking the Silent Spring. It's really profoundly moving and affecting. And then a whole bunch of other online sources. Again, these are all on the flyer that we can offer you. I just wanted to highlight this one, which I discovered more recently, and it's the National Park Service natural sounds page, and there are all kinds of resources here about exploring sound and understanding sound. So if you get a chance, check that out. And I just wanted to conclude by thanking you and by letting this little fellow thank you as well. So this is the sound that I mentioned earlier as what I consider one of the heralds of spring. It's the spring peepers, and it's really not too many months off now that we'll be hearing them again. So with that, I wanted to thank you all for coming in. I know there's lots of other things you've done with your Wednesday late afternoon, and I am going to stop my screen share now and bring Mary Ellen back on.